In this video, we're going to be taking a look at bar graphs, and it's important to know that you use bar graphs to represent data and to show data that can be counted. And we're not only going to look at double bar or single bar graphs, but we'll also look at double bar graphs. And a double bar graph uses two different colored bars to compare two similar sets of data that can be counted. So I want you to write both of these things right here, these points down in your notes, and then we'll continue on throughout the video. A couple different things that you need to understand about a bar graph. First of all, you always need to look at the title. Okay, it's always important to have a title with your bar graph. So we have participants in tennis tournament. That kind of shows us what the data is representing. Without a title in our bar graph, we will never know what we're even representing. Another thing that we need to do is have a vertical axis, which shows here the number of years of participation for each school. So we always have a vertical axis. Okay, we want to label it with the appropriate intervals that could represent the data. Here we have an interval of just 1. Sometimes we may have an interval of 100, sometimes 5, sometimes 2. It all depends on the data. Now, it is important to label the vertical axis as well. You can see number of years. That's the label. Without that label, we would not know what the data is representing on the vertical axis. And then finally, or not finally, but another part of a bar graph is the horizontal axis. And you can see with this data, it shows the different schools that are represented. Okay, and then underneath this horizontal axis, we want to title that horizontal axis. It could be very obvious, but we have the title of school. And then we can also see there's a key that represents the different colors, okay, with our bar graph. So here we have the blue represents the semifinals, the orange represents the finals. Okay, so that's a couple different things that you really need to know about creating a bar graph and all the things that represent a bar graph or a double bar graph. So I'm just going to show you a couple different things from this bar graph. What we have here, you can always see that a bar graph, and you always should know that a bar graph represents data. Okay, now a couple different things. There's a scale that the numbers at equal distances on the axis. Okay, and intervals, distances between the numbers on the axis. So you never want to have, from one interval to the next to be different. You can see here we have an interval of 1, okay, which makes it very easy to read. If you started having intervals of, 1 and then 5, it would make the bar graph very difficult. Okay, so if we were taking a look at this data, I can see that Sandy with the West Conference, that she has 2 titles on the bar graph. However, with the East Conference, she has 4 titles. Okay, you can see Roger, the blue, represents the East Conference, having 5 titles, and you can see from the data there's not any titles from the West Conference. Okay, now if I were to complete this, I would have Bob. We can see with the West Conference, he has 4 titles. Now with that, I can take this bar graph and I'm going to go all the way out to my 4. I make sure it's representing the orange. Okay, now with Bob, we can see that the East Conference, which represents blue, needs to represent 3, so I can just change this orange to blue. I can have it right here, right to the number 3. Okay, now we even want to make that a little bit closer to Bob. Okay, just like that. So that's representing the data in my data file. Finally, Andy, we can see with the West Conference, it's going to be orange, so that's going to be 3. Okay, so I have to make sure that the orange is going all the way out to the 3. And then now Andy, I can see the East Conference titles, which will be blue, is the number 2. I can put it out just like that. Okay, now this double bar graph shows me a lot of different data. Okay, some data that represents men's titles won in the Western Conference and Eastern Conference. I can see that Roger won the most titles out of any conference, going all the way out to 5, and it's very simple because the bar graph goes out the furthest there. Now However, I can see that Roger won the least amount of conference or titles in any conference because he had 0 in the West Conference. Okay, and I can see that the different colors represents the different conferences and the men's titles that are won in those conferences. And some other things that's important to understand about this bar graph, I can have a title. I have a title for my bar graph. My vertical and horizontal axis, they are both labeled with intervals and also the titles as well. We have the player, then the number of titles. So it's important to incorporate these within your bar graphs or your double bar graphs. Okay, so we can see this is an example of another bar graph. Okay, another double bar graph here. A couple things that we want to recognize whenever we're looking at a double bar graph. You always want to look at the title of the bar graph, which is National Park Visitors. Okay, you want to look at the vertical and horizontal axis. Okay, you want to see what the interval is. You can see it's 0.5, but this is actually number of millions. Okay, so this is actually a 500,000 intervals. Okay, with going up my vertical axis, and then the horizontal axis, we can see Grand Canyon and so on. Okay, and the park is the title there. So those are the different parks, and we can see that. So this is just data that shows us the annual attendance in millions. Okay, from 1990 all the way and comparing it to 2000. All right. So if I want to represent the data from the Olympic Park, I can see in 1990 it needs to be red. All right. So I can see that the Olympic Park is 2.8 million. Okay, in 1990. So what I do is I take my first bar graph and I want to have it between the 2.5 and the 3.0 there. Okay, not quite up to the 3.0, but not above it as well. Then as far as the year 2000, I can see the Olympic Park is 3.3 million. So I would just take my orangish yellowish color and I could go right a little above that 3.0. Okay, I didn't quite get all the way down to the bottom there, so what I will do is just expand this a little bit more. There we go. I can even move my bar right next to that, show it representing the two different data points. And finally, Yellowstone, I can see first of all in 1990 there was 2.8 million. So what I can do is take my bar graph, go a little bit above that 2.5, not quite up to the 3.0 with the red, and then 2.8 million in 2000 as well, so I can go right next to that. Same exact height there. Okay, I can even expand these a little bit bigger here. Okay, so we can see the data from this double bar graph shows that the largest amount of attendance by any park overall was the Grand Canyon, because we had, you can see the double bar graphs go higher than any other double bar graph that represents the attendance from the different parks. Okay, that we can see as far as the some other bar graphs here. The Yellowstone Park had the equal amount of attendance just because the double bar graphs are the same height. Okay, so we can understand what a double bar graph is by looking at the title, looking at the different titles on the vertical axis, horizontal axis, and also it's important to know that the different colors on this double bar graph does represent different amounts of data. Now we can see this double bar graph here. Okay, we know it represents sweater costs from a store, and then on the vertical axis we can see that it's intervals of 10, and this represents the cost. Horizontal axis is brand A, B, C, and D. All right, so we can see that's represented by the brand. Now D does not have any data, so we'll just ignore that actually for the brand D. So we're taking a look at brand C. I'm sorry, A, B, and C. And the question that we have here, what I want you to do is answer this question in your notes. For which brand did the price increase most from 1970 to the year 2000? So I can see that brand A had $30, and then in 1970 to $60. Okay, we can see that that's a $60 increase. Brand B, $20 to $70. Okay, that would be a $50 increase. $40 to $60, that would be a $20 increase. So we can see, just based upon the double bar graph, that which brand did the price increase the most from 1970 to the year 2000. We could say that brand B increased the most from 1970 to the year 2000. What I want you to do now is pause this video, and I want you to look at the data in the data file, and I want you to get graph paper, and I want you to complete this double bar graph, and I will have the answers for you, or as far as what it should look like when you press play. Do not forget to label every axis. Make sure you have the intervals the correct way, and like I said, when you press play, I will have the correct answers for you. So pause the video now. Okay, this is what your double bar graph should look like. Okay, we can see that North Carolina in 1990 we had 6.6 million, the population. So we can see that the double bar graph is definitely in the middle and a little bit closer to that 7 than it is the 6. Okay, we can see that North Carolina, 8 million. Okay, so that double bar graph ends right on that, exactly on that 8. Okay, Virginia, we can see that in 1990, 6.2 million. So that blue part is a little bit above that 6 because that's representing the year 1990. Okay, the census from 1990. And finally, in Virginia, we can see that in the year 2000 there were 7.1 million. We can see that the green part of my double bar graph goes a little bit above that 7.0 on the vertical axis. Okay, so we can see from this double bar graph a few different things. We can see that Virginia had the largest population in both 1990 and the year 2000, and we know that because the double bar graph is the highest, which represents the most amount of data. Okay, so this will give you a little bit more information about double bar graphs and how to read double bar graphs and all the things that represent a double bar graph. For example, the titles, the intervals, and so on. If you have any questions about this, please come and see me.